Guys, welcome back to online and social media. We've spent a lot of time talking about media in this course. What I want to focus on over these next couple days is advertising and how it relates to what we consider media. Now, obviously, there's a lot of advertising in itself that is technically media, but when we talk about media today, I want you to think of media more in terms of journalism and journalistic outlets. So that's kind of the relationship I want to explore today because it's a relationship that's kind of sculpted the landscape that exists for information today, which has been a key focal point of this course kind of all semester long. So we're going to dive into that relationship during this section. So let's go all the way back. Let's go back to the beginning of this relationship. So when newspapers were kind of first starting out, they needed a way to fund themselves, and people could get subscriptions, right? And that would provide them with some income. But they wanted to keep the cost of subscription pretty low because they needed everyone to be able to access this information, right? We've talked about how journalism kind of is a public service in a way where it functions as a way to keep democracy alive. And so they want everyone to be able to get this. So they keep the cost of subscriptions low. Now, if the cost of subscriptions is low, you're not getting a lot of revenue there. And so the papers need to be able to pay the reporters that work there, the editors that work there, the photographers that work there, the layout designers that work there. All those people need to get paid. So they have to find a way to bring in revenue. And what they found was advertising was the way to do this. So for a large part of our history as far as media is concerned, advertisers have been the main people supporting journalism. They kind of had this symbiotic relationship. Advertisers needed a way to get their product out there, to promote their product. And since for most of our history, people have taken in this news and information all the time from journalists. And so they had this large reach. Like there's a lot of circulation in newspapers as we advance into television and radio. There's a lot of people watching those things or listening to those things. And so advertisers have this large reach. And so they kind of came to this agreement. We will pay you guys to promote our products. And that's like a tricky thing ethically for journalists, right? They don't want to be promoting products. So what kind of ends up happening is this happy medium where if it's on television, they go to these breaks and you see commercial breaks, and then they come back and they give you more news, and then they go to a break. So those breaks, those little advertisers aren't the journalists promoting those things to you. They are kind of situated separate from the newscast itself as these little breaks that are help paying for that newscast. The same way when you read a newspaper, the ads are part of the newspaper, or traditionally they weren't. Obviously, we are a weird section of native advertising, which is very questionable ethically. But for most part, ads were kind of this separate thing that existed in the newspaper. You could see the ad, and the advertisers were hoping, oh, you see this ad, and so you're going to want to go buy our product. And in turn, the newspaper was like, cool, it's separated off. This is an ad. This is not journalism. But we need this ad to pay for everything and to allow us to exist. So that's the relationship that kind of has existed for a very long time. And it was one that was profitable for both, right? Advertisers felt like they were getting a lot of people buying the product, so they wanted to continue to promote. Journalism was well funded, and they were able to do all their reports, and they were able to fund newspapers on a local and national level and broadcast on a local and national level. The problem exists in this weird ethical situation where it could sometimes get tricky because obviously a journalist has to report the news, and sometimes advertisers, these products end up in the news, and it's not always for something good, right? Sometimes it is, but sometimes they're embezzling money or they've done something that the Consumer Protection Agency doesn't find right. And so as a journalist, you need to report on this because it's affecting the people that need this information. As an advertiser, you're in this catch-22. You're paying these people to run your advertisement, but in that same place you're running their advertisement, there's this story that is kind of crushing your company and promoting this negative thing that happened with your company, which you don't ultimately want. And it created this weird situation where sometimes advertisers would threaten to pull their ads, and ethical journalists would say that's fine, you can do that, but we have to report this news. But it creates this weird situation where journalists had to started kind of thinking about this thing they shouldn't be thinking about at all, right? Well, if this is my advertiser, can I really run this story? And that's never the situation a journalist should be in. But there were some on the not most ethical side that did think about things like that. And the owners of newspapers would think about things like that because the bottom line was something they had to worry about to keep that paper in business. And so you had this weird incentive not to report against advertisers. And it could create a culture if it got out of hand where this advertiser could kind of skate and not get reported on because they were giving enough money to this media outlet. And so that was problematic. But it was something that was kind of seen as this necessary evil. And for the most part, we didn't see it running amok or causing big issues. But that can kind of be something as seen as this little part of the relationship that was already starting to fracture and fray. And that's when we move to the next step, right? Which is the internet. So when the internet rises, it does a couple different things. The first thing it does is it creates this place where people can go and consume content on their own timeline. And it's structured in their own way that they want it to be structured instead of having to wait, right? With a newspaper, you had to wait till the newspaper would come in the morning. With television, you had to wait until that news show showed up. Or even if you were watching a television show, you need to wait for that television show. The internet allowed people to time shift, where if we posted something, you could wait till later to read it. Or if it was a show, you could wait till later to watch it. And eventually we got to the point where people could just kind of skip through ads if they didn't want them. They could kind of not really view the advertising in the light that the advertisers wanted. So that's the first issue that kind of approaches this situation. The next thing that happens is Craigslist. And it's weird to think of Craigslist as this thing that really hurts journalism. But for many, many years, the big addition of the newspaper was the Sunday newspaper. And the Sunday newspaper would come in and would have all these ads. It would have coupons that people could use at the grocery store. There were many people that only ordered the Sunday version of the newspaper. It was much, much bigger than the Monday through Saturday versions of the newspaper. And the Sunday version had all kinds of chock full of advertisement. And another thing that existed in a lot of these Sunday papers was personal ads. People would put these ads into this section. They would pay the newspaper to run these little personal ads. A lot of times they were like, hey, I need help on this job, or they're trying to sell something. And these personal ads made a huge part of the revenue stream for these newspapers. Craigslist comes along, and people can start posting these personal ads they used to post in the newspaper. They can post them on this Craigslist site, and they didn't have to pay for it. And they were reaching a larger audience than they were reaching with the newspaper, and they were reaching more people. And so suddenly the newspaper's entire personal ad revenue starts drying up really fast. So that's kind of the first kind of shot across the bow. Now, for many years, advertisers had set advertising rates based on either circulation, which is how many people bought a newspaper or magazine, or in television, your ratings, how many people were watching your television station. So more popular stations could charge advertisers more money to advertise on their airwaves, just like bigger newspapers with larger circulation could charge more. So there's this competition that was existing. And a lot of places had multiple newspapers in one city. You would have 3 to 4 television stations in each local city. And there's this competition that existed. Nowadays, many of you probably have grown up in this era where there's only one newspaper in most cities. And a lot of cities don't have newspapers. And there's probably a couple different television stations still existing, but generally they're not quite as competitive as they used to be because their ratings are dwindling as we see more and more options available for what people can watch on television. So this is all happening at once. The next thing that happens is big data and social media. So the first people to recognize the power of data was actually Google. And Google gets on and they're tracking everything that their consumers do on Google, like what they're searching for. And what they're trying to do is figure out what people want so they can filter your search results and make it something you might be more interested in. But what they did find out was all this data they were collecting on you, they could sell to advertisers who were very interested in this data. And they were like, wait a minute, if we know what people are searching for, then we can target specific people, which is something you couldn't do with kind of the broad advertising we would see in journalism for many years. So that's the first thing that happens. The next thing that happens is Facebook builds this massive, essentially data tracking software, which is what Facebook is. Now, we think of it as social media. That's what it is for us. On the back end, Facebook itself is simply trafficking your data. And so they have all this data on everyone that uses their software. And every other social media company kind of follows suit. And so now advertisers have this place where they have way more people than would ever be reading a newspaper or watching the news. So they have a larger swath of an audience. And they can target specific sections of this audience and know for kind of a fact what they might be interested in so they can tailor their messaging to these people. And when that happens, suddenly they look at journalism as this place they don't want to spend ads anymore. There's less risk, right? You may no negative stories are going to be written about you. You're now reaching a larger audience. You can target this audience. So they move their advertising budgets to social media and they move their advertising budgets to Google. And they still have some left over to spend on the media, but not as much. And this advertising shift has wide ranging consequences that a lot of people don't even fully recognize. So the first thing it does is it devastates the news industry. It was pretty catastrophic, and to this day, we're still seeing those effects. We start seeing newspapers close. There's most cities, like I said, now have that one major newspaper. A lot of those smaller newspapers that existed in some smaller cities, a lot of those don't exist anymore. We've seen television stations shut down. I actually worked for a television station that went bankrupt in 2008, and they've never really kind of gotten back to the point where they're broadcasting as often as they used to. So what ends up happening if all these journalism outlets start dying and disappearing is you end up with something that's called a news desert, where you live in a community, but no one is really covering that specific community, right? The journalism there cannot afford to exist there. So you don't have someone covering your city council or your school board meeting or what the mayor is doing. And because you don't have this information, suddenly whoever's in office and all these decisions don't have a check or balance. And they can kind of do whatever they want with very little pushback from the people that live within that community because the community doesn't know what's going on and creates what's known as a news desert. So obviously, hopefully you can see that news deserts are very bad for democracy and for the population in general. But those have started existing and cropping up all over America, and you see them all over the place. The other thing that happens is these larger news entities in bigger cities, while they're able to maintain an existence and they're able to continue to cover things, they can't cover them in the same way they used to because they are also facing some funding issues. It's not bad enough that they're shutting down, but it is bad enough that they're having to cut costs. And because they're cutting costs, now they don't have as many reporters on staff. They don't have as many photographers. They don't have as many people covering the news. And when you have less people covering the news, then you start missing stories, right? So stories that they used to cover or things like city council meetings and those smaller things that we don't think about that often, they're no longer covering. And yes, for the most part, you're probably not missing a ton of news. I've covered many school board meetings that not much of anything got covered. But there are times when big events happen at these places. And if we aren't there to cover them as journalists, right? If there's no journalists there covering that, then the public themselves don't even know that this massive thing happened. And then the institutions themselves are able to spin the messaging whatever way they want. There's no check and balance on it. There's no neutral third party there to explain the situation in a matter of fact way. And that becomes dangerous as well. So hopefully you can kind of see the crumbling of news kind of relates back to advertisers starting to pull their funding. And so, right now, in our current state, it's not that journalism doesn't exist and there's not still great journalism out there. It's that it's struggling, and they're still trying to find answers. There's been some really interesting work with how could they be funded by philanthropy? Could they be funded by almost kind of like operating as a nonprofit is one of the things that we've seen a lot. We'll probably go more into this later in the semester about funding of things, but just know that the relationship crumbling between advertising and journalism had this long reaching impact on journalism. The other thing that happens is things that used to be that you consider free aren't really free. And what I mean by that is if you use any social media site or almost anything that says it's free, it's not free. Like you don't have to pay for it, but you are actually the product. So when you use Facebook, you view Facebook as this place where you can interact with others. Facebook views Facebook as a way to make money, and the way they make money is by selling you, the consumer, right? They sell your data and everything you're doing as they track you across the internet. And they use everything that you're doing and they sell your data to advertisers so that advertisers can then target you with specific ads. This is why when you visit a website and then you go to social media, suddenly you will see an ad pop up for this site that you just went to because they are tracking you across these various sites in a chance to collect that data so they can sell it to advertisers. So advertisers are seeing kind of this new way of interacting. And that's the other thing that's changed. Advertisers themselves interact differently. So for many, many years, advertisers were just kind of this brand. And you bought the brand because either it was something that was cool or something that you needed or you liked their commercial, but it was just kind of this entity that exists out there that you were buying. Nowadays, brands interact and engage with people in a much different fashion. They engage with people almost like people engage with people, right? They create their own social media accounts and they try to interact with the public and like they're a person instead of this brand or company. They can personalize the way they promote and advertise to people now because they can create various different campaigns to really focus in on this small section of an audience. And they can really hammer home their messaging to the people that they know are already prone to buy their product. So advertising has changed as well, as they are now marketing for a different type of person, a more specific person than that general overall person that they used to kind of market towards when they were just kind of funding journalism. So hopefully you can kind of see how all these things kind of have evolved together, and we've ended up at this weird spot where journalism is struggling because it's not being funded as well. Advertisers are still seeing their products get bought, and social media and Google search engine are thriving because of all this revenue that's coming in from advertisers. And so what we see is our information environment is changed, and everyone's getting their information from a different source now. And that source is where we're getting all this revenue from, but it's not a source that's been verified or fact checked like you see in journalism. So that's kind of that relationship and the stages it's went through. What I want to do now is kind of move towards the assignment portion of today. So your assignment is I want you to think to yourself about two brands and make them brands that you're familiar with, that you know pretty well. And I want you to look up some advertising that those brands did on traditional media, such as newspaper or on a television station, and see what that looks like. Then I want you to go to those brand social media feeds. So on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, wherever you want to find it, and see how they interact there. And then I want you to write me just a couple paragraphs about what's the same, kind of how is that interaction still similar, but what's different too? How are they acting different as a social media account than they are as this brand that has commercials and advertising? That's it for today's lesson. Next lesson, we're going to dive into social media campaigns, since these days advertising mostly exists on social media.